Hey guys, it's Paul Myers, owner and lead therapist of Intentional Counseling. We are a group counseling practice in Frisco, and we specialize in mental health. And today we're going to cover some basics of addiction. So we're going to cover some symptoms of addiction, some science behind addiction, how to tell whether you're addicted or not, and we're also going to cover the things that technically are addictive, right, as well. So let's dive right in. We have an addiction chart here that I show. I've been getting a new flood of clients just asking for addiction treatment in general. So I find this really helpful, really common. And so we have three scales when it comes to addiction that kind of explain the science behind how addiction works in our brain. And all addiction functions the same regardless of what your addiction is. As far as your brain's concerned, it functions the same. Some are just more potent than others. So this is the functioning of addiction. We have this first scale, which is your level of use. So whatever you're addicted to, the more you use it, the frequency of use, the level of use, the intensity of the use, the potency, the amount of times you use, all of that really constitutes this scale here. And so from 0% to 100%, you can kind of be anywhere along that scale. Then here we have scale 2. This is your dopamine release scale. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in your brain. There are many neurotransmitters in your brain, but this is the particular neurotransmitter that we've linked addiction to. And it's actually the way at which we measure how addictive something really is, right? So it's a neurotransmitter in your brain responsible for pleasure. So anytime we do anything enjoyable or pleasurable, it produces dopamine, right? Now, the more dopamine produced, the more addictive that thing is. So we can actually go in, and if we looked at an EEG scan, we could see neuropathways in your brain and measure the amount of dopamine that you're getting when you use something, right? This is very interesting. So the more dopamine, the more enjoyable, and the more addictive something is, right? So that's what that scale is. Then we have the third scale, which is your tolerance level. And that's just another way to describe the desensitization effect. Anything that you use that's addictive, that produces dopamine, your brain gets desensitized to it over time. And so the more desensitized your brain is, the higher your tolerance level is. So from 0 to 100%, 0 being no tolerance, 100% being maximum tolerance, maximum desensitization. Okay? Now, let's kind of explain how these are all correlated and how we can develop an addiction, because it's a gradual progression. It's never an instant thing. So we have your level of use. So at first, when we use just a little bit, usually our template will start off very low. We're all, when we're born, we have like a clean slate. Our brains are clean, they're developing, and so our tolerance really starts out at 0 for everybody, right? And so when our tolerance is low, the level that we use, even just a little bit here, is going to get you a nice and solid dopamine release there. So it's going to be very enjoyable, especially the first time you use something. Okay. Now, all three of these are correlated. So typically, the level of use, as the level of use increases, your tolerance also increases, and the amount of dopamine that you're going to get is going to decrease. So these are all correlated in that way. So low tolerance, you use a little bit, you get a nice dopamine release. But over time, as the more you get accustomed, the more your brain gets accustomed, your body gets accustomed to the addictive thing that you're doing, your tolerance is going to raise. So that tolerance is going to match. And what's going to happen? Your dopamine release is now going to drop. So you're not going to get that release that you are accustomed to. And so what do we have to do? Well, we have to increase the level of use in order to get that dopamine release we want again. Okay? Boom, we're getting that dopamine release. We had to use more this time, or use it more frequently or in longer amounts. And again, your tolerance is going to go up. And the more you use, tolerance is going to raise. Once your tolerance raises, you no longer get that dopamine release. And that's the cycle, and that continues on and on and on as you just climb the ladder of addiction, and your tolerance continues to raise, and we get more and more addicted, right? So, addiction can really happen to anyone. No one's exempt. So whether you're a particularly self-disciplined person or not so much, addiction can happen to you regardless, because your brain always will say yes to more dopamine. It's never going to say no. To your brain thinks dopamine is very good, and so we will always want more, never less, right? We also can't really regulate the amount of dopamine that you're going to get. Your brain's going to do that for you. And so because of that, whether you're strong or weak or big or small or young or old, addiction can still happen to you if you're not careful and you are not really moderating, or if you don't have good boundaries with things that are addictive, right? Another thing to realize is that addiction is always more powerful than we are because of that. So if you do have an addiction, or you are struggling with an addiction, it's not really a representation of how weak you are, how strong you are. It's really just science. It's going to do what it does to you, right? And it always becomes more powerful and snowballs on itself and becomes unmanageable at some point, right? If we allow it. Okay? So let's cover what some options are of things that are addictive. So there's a lot of things, but even food can be addictive. Things that have high sugar content can be addictive. Video games can be addictive. Any form of technology is addictive technically. So our phones are addictive, iPads, apps, YouTube, social media is highly addictive. They design these devices and these platforms and these apps to be very stimulating, very easy to use, and very addictive because it's effective, right? And so technology is very addictive. We also have anything sexually oriented is usually very addictive. Sex produces a very large dopamine release. So whether it's actual sexual intimacy or pornography or masturbation or any form of sexual experience, that's all very addictive. And of course, the classic addiction is drugs and alcohol. And so alcohol technically is a central nervous system depressant, as well as lots of types of drugs are central nervous system depressants. THC or marijuana is a depressant. Heroin or opiates are depressants, for examples. Benzodiazepines, right? Or stimulants like cocaine, methamphetamines, nicotine, caffeine even, those are all stimulants, right? So all of those are examples of substances that are addictive, which everyone usually is pretty aware of those. So those are addictive things, some options of common addictions that I see. Some things to note with addiction, how do I really know if I'm addicted or not? Well, let's look at some common symptoms of addiction. So classic symptoms, every addicted person I've ever seen is going to rationalize and justify and deny away their addiction. So when I meet with people who are addicted, they're really struggling, they're in that early stage, they're going to say things like, well, it's really not that big of a deal. They're going to minimize it. They're going to deny, I don't really have an addiction, I could stop at any time, or, I only drink after 5, or I only do it on the weekends, or it helps me, it makes me feel better, it takes my stress away, right? And so those are common rationalizations, justifications. We make excuses in our brain. Something about what addiction does to us really limits our ability to function cognitively and really process things normally, and it kind of takes us out of reality a little bit. And so classic addiction is rationalizing, justifying, and denying, minimizing the problem. Other addiction symptoms are covering up the problem, lying about the problem, manipulating other people into supporting the addiction. Also, addiction symptoms are depressions linked to addiction. Just from a neurobiological standpoint, it's very common. Shame and guilt are also very common with addiction. Anxiety and stress, because just addiction creates so many problems for us. Other addiction symptoms are when it starts becoming really problematic, which means it's affecting our health, it's affecting our finances negatively, it's affecting our primary relationship negatively, which would be a spouse or a loved one. It's affecting your social, occupational, or academic functioning negatively, right? You know, limiting your ability to do well in things that you need to pursue that are important, right? Other addiction symptoms would be where you feel powerless or it's unmanageable in your life, and you try to fail, or you try to stop but you fail, and you relapse consistently, right? And then other addiction symptoms would be salience, which is it dominates your thoughts, or you think about it a lot or obsess about it a lot, right? Or legal problems or dangerous situations even are signs of addiction as well. So, okay? So, all that to say, if you're not really sure you have an addiction, my final challenge to you is go 30 days without it and just see how you feel. If you're having withdrawal, if you're having a pull towards it, or you're finding yourself obsessing about it or thinking about it every day, you're probably addicted. So you can conquer addiction. It doesn't have to rule your life. If you don't have a therapist, I would highly recommend you get one. There are addiction treatments out there, which we'll cover in a different video. But if you have any questions, comments, we'd love to hear from you, and hopefully this is helpful for you. So thanks for stopping by, and take care.